do we choose what the events are that we talk about? Ah, which events are history?
That already happened.
They've already happened, but which ones are they? Because, you know, people got up, they ate their breakfast, they milked the cow, they took the train. Those aren't usually the kinds of events that we talk about in history, yes?
That had consequences?
That had consequences. He proposed to you and you said yes.
Consequences for a whole country, overall, for a whole world.
So not private.
Not private.
Okay. Could it be private if it was a monk?
No.
Okay, so it looks private, but it turns out to have consequences for other people if it was, let us say, Saint Tikhon? Yes, okay. See how complicated it becomes immediately? So that possibly at school, I was very shocked as a schoolgirl when our teacher gave us a series of paragraphs from the histories of World War II from quite different countries, all translated into English, I hasten to say, because they were completely different. And this was a shock, because I thought history was what was true about the past. Well, so did you. But as you've got older, you've seen that people write histories in different ways. And let me tell you, in the Middle Ages, they didn't have a lot of archives. Worse, they didn't have Professor Google. There was no place they could look things up. So they required a different kind of memory. And when they started to write narratives about the past, they started by making lists. In April, there was an earthquake and the king died. And then they started to write narratives, which are histories of their king, what they took to be their country, their monastery, their convent, their trip to Rome, their voyage to India. And each of these categories offers you a different way of remembering important things that happened in the past. Sometimes history was hidden as a letter. Sometimes it wasn't. At the beginning, at least in Western Europe, it was in Latin. Later, it was translated and then it was composed in the vernacular of whatever the place was. But whatever you were doing, it would be about kings, aristocrats, battles, the count in the place, the county where you lived, the monastery, the convent, the cathedral where you worked, and each of these would be different approaches to the rapidly disappearing things that happened between getting up and going to bed for people all over the world, all over Europe, all over Paris. Lots of competing ideas about the past, about what happened in Paris. Furthermore, if you live in a society which most of the time doesn't have proofs for what it's writing about, but has traditions about what it's writing about, you have to find a different way of thinking about writing. So you can no longer just say, in April it rained and then the king died, but you start to look at old books from Rome and to see how they do it. And then you take the ways that they do it and you do them in your own language. So imagine a historical outrage during war in which the soldiers come and they kill nuns. This is found in lots of rhetorical historiographical books that we read about the Middle Ages. It doesn't mean that the soldiers came and they killed nuns, although the soldiers may have come and they may have killed nuns, although unless you were a Viking, it was pretty unusual. What that is what we call a topos. This is a Greek word, in English T-O-P-O-S, and it means a commonplace. It means something that we use in order to say something and to say something else. So what that means is there was a complete breakdown of order. Do you see how that works? Maybe? A little bit. Yes?
I don't get it.
That's another person sacrificing herself for the good of all. Okay, if you say, all hands on deck, as you might in a ship, that's a metonymy. You know about this. You say all hands, where hand represents the body of a sailor, right?
People.
People, very easy. This is a bigger, slightly different way of doing something similar. Probably I'm in a room, this is a great luxury for me, where more than one person has read the Brothers Karamazov. Would that be true? Yeah, okay. Little murmurs are always welcome. Do you remember Alexei goes into a monastery and he makes himself the disciple of a monk? Yes? And the monk dies and there's a terrific scandal. Why is there a scandal?
Because there was a smell?
There's a smell, that's right. There's decomposition. The monk dies, they lay him out, they pray around his body, and it starts decomposing and it smells. This belongs to a topos that they didn't teach you at school. And this is the idea that sanctity resists the body's decomposition. So here's this man they thought was extraordinarily holy, and his body is rotting just like everybody else's body. And that's why there's a scandal when they start to smell this poor dead monk's rotting corpse. So that's a place where Dostoevsky is making a completely tasteless joke about credulity. And if you read historiography from the Middle Ages, you'll find that these things are around all over the place. So the woman who was ill and couldn't have children went to the shrine of the local saint, and bingo, she was pregnant. I mean, you've seen that any number of times. They do often leave out exactly how she got pregnant, but this is a story that we're telling. And these literary ways of coding, of writing about something that happened in ways that people will understand immediately, dominated the way people wrote history until early in the 17th century. There are people in the 16th century who are starting to do this, partly because the more international trade there is, the more writing there is. The more exchanges there are between this monastery and that monastery of books, the more people can read different things. So, fast forward, shall we, to King Lear. King Lear is a story of folklore and legend. He first appears in a book when Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was a Welsh prelate in Wales, it doesn't always follow, but in this case it does, in fact, Monmouth, started writing a history of Britain. And the history of Britain that he wrote is based on a succession of kings. So the genealogy that you've got there tells you who was king before Lear and who lived after Lear as a descendant. The scary thing about all of this, though you may consider it a joke if you prefer, is it looks like a genealogy, but it isn't. So many of you in your families will have a little chart somewhere that says who your mother's parents were and who their parents were, and you can consult that if you want to. And the more information there is, the prouder the family is likely to be. The best place in the world for you to look at this is the Mormon website, M-O-R-M-O-N. These are, this is a cult, mainly in Utah, but with people believing it all over the world. One of the tenets of Mormonism is that if you convert, you save the souls of all your ancestors. So the Mormon Church has the best genealogical website on the planet. Probably your great-great-uncle is on this genealogy if anybody in your family became a Mormon. And what the Mormons do is they get more and more and more information. So even if somebody in your family wasn't a Mormon, the genealogy may be there. People believe these things. They believe that they're correct. They may get the spelling of a name wrong, but they think that it's true. So what you are looking at, somewhere in there, there is a picture with a bunch of heads on it. Try the next one, from Adam and Eve. Yes, that one's fine. And you have a picture of that one. So that's a screenshot from a roll. Everybody knows the difference between a scroll and a codex.
No.
Everybody doesn't have the vocabulary. Would somebody hold up a book, please? Book. This is a book. If you open this book, it has pages, right? Mm-hmm. And then it has another page. Will you? Thank you. It's really easy to move back and forth because you probably remember that what you were looking for was on the right-hand page. In a scroll, you can't do that. You use a scroll many times every day. Scrolls of parchment, of which this is one, were rolled up and put in little cubby holes in libraries. But this may not have occurred to you, but when you're writing a paper on your computer, you're creating a scroll because it's this wide and it continues up and down. You probably put page numbers on your scroll, which is much more like a book. When you print it out, it's even more like a book. But when you're working on it, on a computer, it's a scroll. So a book, codex, is just the Latin word for a book. I don't know what the Latin word for a scroll is, but Mr. Google knows. Mr. Google is a theme now, every time I'm lecturing. So, how do we find out about who Lear is in legends? It's either the one before or the one after. From Adam and Eve. Okay. Well, you have this going around the room. Can you turn it? Maybe.
I try.
Ah, wonderful. Okay. You can't see this very well. You can see it better on the piece of paper. This is Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So this is the beginning of all human genealogy. And this is a book which tells you about different things that happened in different places. So you get the Old Testament, you get Rome, you get what happened in your own country, and you get the histories of these little thumbnails, shall we call them, which look like genealogies, are set up like genealogies, but may not be genealogies. So this is a visual historiography which you can read and look at, but there's not necessarily a reason why they're true. For example, if it says and then there was the Trojan War, you can believe it or not, depending on what you like. If it says something else, that can be much more important. And the something else is that when kings came to the throne, they depended on descent, acceptance by the people, and sometimes conquest. And that was the way of saying you were legitimately the heir to the throne. Unfortunately, in human history, things are more complicated than that. And in this case, you get kings of England whose claim to the throne may not be wonderful. Can we open a window? I see people who spent a long time on a bus this morning starting to conk out. Well, window wardens, see if you can get some air in here so that nobody actually dies before my lecture is over. Henry VIII, for example, he's the one with all the wives, a couple of whom survived, claimed the throne by showing that his father, Henry VII, acceded to the throne by acclamation, conquest, and descent. That's all hooey. He didn't have the best claim to the throne, and so a number of people disappeared and were never seen or heard of again. And Richard III did the same thing. So